Thank you, Rusty, for your introduction. Thank you all for being here this evening on this cool Louisiana evening. It's cool in here, at least. So. All right, so I think you know my topic, elevated by the past, the normative role of tradition in life. Every time a Christian liturgy is celebrated, various prayers, hymns, and readings must be said or sung, and actions, both practical and symbolic, must be performed by various people. The event will most likely also involve movable objects, furnishings, and special clothing. If we were to limit ourselves to this 30,000-foot view, most Christian liturgies have a lot in common. You have a minister leading it, a few persons in supporting roles, the Bible, and some bread and wine. But as the saying goes, the devil's in the details, which is a somewhat twisted way of thinking because God is to be found in the details much more. Unlike papal in-flight press conferences, liturgy does not exist at a distance of 30,000 feet. It is something highly concrete, articulate, and definite. It cannot be generic or vague, but must commit itself to this or that particular path each step of the way. The urgent question then arises, how ought Christian liturgy to be celebrated? Do we make it up as we go along? Do we hire someone to make it up for us? Do we assemble a committee and ask them to prepare drafts and vote on them? Or can we find it already complete somewhere and gratefully take it up, so that instead of wasting our energy on reinventing the wheel, we can devote ourselves rather to making the most prayerful and beautiful use of this gift? Well, Catholics once had a compelling answer to the question, how is liturgy to be celebrated? The answer was as rich as it was simple: tradition. We received our liturgy from apostolic tradition developed over centuries of faithful practice. Because the apostles were united around Christ in the cenacle, authentic rites of worship will always have certain features in common. But because the apostles were scattered throughout the world and planted local churches everywhere they went, our rites will also be diverse as Greek and Latin, Coptic and Slavic, Ambrosian, Roman, Mozarabic, just to name a few. But the fundamental intuition or instinct of a Catholic was always to look for tradition so that we could be confident that what we were doing and how we were doing it rested as much as possible on precedent. The precedent of thousands of saints, countless churches and chapels of Christendom, untold armies of priests, monks, nuns, and layfolk. Against this unanimous practice of nearly 2,000 years of apostolic sacramental Christianity, Eastern and Western, it is no small problem today that the answer to the same question, how is liturgy to be celebrated, has become vexed, divisive, explosive. It has become thus for one and only one reason: the normativity of tradition has been repudiated. Those who refuse to be guided by it have fallen into an arbitrariness from which there is no escape, except by still further arbitrary decisions and actions. It is time to get back to a better way of thinking and acting. Ecclesiastical traditions, especially in regard to the externals of liturgy and its development over time, must be honored and preserved because they are intimately connected with the content and practice of religion. Catholicism is inherently a religion of tradition. This shouldn't be a controversial statement, but nowadays it is. The Apostle Paul wrote to the Corinthians, "I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I have delivered them unto you." And to the Thessalonians, "So then, brethren, stand firm and hold to the traditions which you were taught by us, either by word of mouth or by letter." In his treatise on the Holy Spirit, published in the year 375, St. Basil the Great writes, quote, "Of the dogmas and messages preserved in the Church, some we possess from written teaching, and others we receive from the tradition of the apostles, handed on to us in mystery. In respect to piety, both are of the same force. No one will contradict any of these. No one, at any rate, who is even moderately versed in ecclesiastical matters. Indeed, were we to try to reject unwritten customs as having no great authority, we would unwittingly injure the gospel in its vitals. Unquote. St. Basil helpfully tells us the sort of thing he has in mind, and if we listen carefully, we will hear some examples that may surprise us. Quote, to take the first and most general example, who is there who has taught us in writing to sign with the sign of the cross those who have trusted in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ? Talking about baptism. What writing has taught us to turn to the east at the Eucharistic prayer? Which of the saints has left us in writing the words of the invocation at the displaying of the bread of the Eucharist and the cup of blessing? For we are not, as is well known, content with what the apostle or the gospel has recorded, but both in preface and conclusion we add other words as being of great importance to the validity of the ministry, and these we derive from unwritten teaching. Moreover, we bless the water of baptism and the oil of the chrism, and besides this, the catechumen who is being baptized. By what scriptures do we do this? Is it not by the secret and mystical tradition? Nay, by what written word is the anointing of oil itself taught? And whence comes the custom of baptizing thrice? It means pouring water or dunking three times. And as to the other customs of baptism, from what scripture do we derive the renunciation of Satan and his angels? Does not this come from that unpublished and secret teaching which our fathers guarded in a silence, out of the reach of curious meddling and inquisitive investigation? Unquote. That's the most important text in the Fathers of the Church on the oral tradition. The oral tradition. Another church father, St. Vincent of Lerins, in the year 434, has this to say, quote, keep the deposit. What is the deposit? That which has been entrusted to you, not that which you yourselves have devised. A matter not of cleverness, but of learning, not of private adoption, but of public tradition. A matter brought to you, not put forth by you, wherein you are bound to be not an author, but a keeper, not a teacher, but a disciple, not a leader, but a follower. Keep the deposit. Preserve the talent of Catholic faith, inviolate, unadulterated. That which has been entrusted to you, let it continue in your possession, let it be handed on by you. You have received gold, give gold in return. Unquote. Such quotations can be easily multiplied. The church fathers see Christianity as a social and hierarchical religion in which the apostles and their successors have been entrusted with dogmas, liturgical practices, and moral judgments that are intended to be passed on faithfully from one generation to the next. They are speaking about the concrete content of the revealed faith, as well as the practices that enshrine it and perpetuate it. These we must approach with the right disposition of soul, namely, the humble receptivity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. But why did our Lord set things up this way, with tradition as our point of reference? There are two basic reasons. First, because it harmonizes with our human nature. Second, because it harmonizes with the church as the mystical body of Christ, a social body in which the members depend upon one another and share goods with each other, not only here and now, but across all the ages and for all eternity. This supernatural interconnectedness of Christians in the church is founded on, and to some degree, mimics the natural dependencies of human persons upon their families, neighbors, friends, and compatriots. In short, man is a tradition-constituted animal. The source in human nature of tradition is man's place in the hierarchy of being. Man is more self-transcendent than what is beneath him. Plants have no consciousness at all, so they have no capacity for transcendence. Brute animals do have consciousness, which enables them to be aware of things and of things other than themselves. But their consciousness is confined to material singulars, without the ability to produce out of them a higher synthesis, that is, a continuous texture of time as a field in which thoughts and free actions occur. Man, in contrast, has the power of rationality that integrates the multiplicity of sense experiences into a tapestry of meanings, intentions, communications, and reflections. Rationality makes possible a true self-transcendence, which allows man to live diachronically, that means across times, not as an orphan or a prisoner of the moment. Tradition is therefore as natural to man as moral and intellectual virtue. And like virtue, tradition not only makes human life more human and more happy, it carries with it obligations. Just as our rationality implies and impels us to virtue, and we are answerable for our vices, so too we have a duty to remain connected to our natural and supernatural heritage. Man's reason is, in fact, traditional in nature and cannot be otherwise. We see this in how we learn language, which pre-exists us as something handed down to us, and how we belong to a people and a nation prior to any choice we make as individuals. To inherit a body of knowledge, wisdom, and affections is native to rational animals. Therefore, we can expect grace to build on nature and for the supernatural life to function analogously. We have a heavenly fatherland, or patria, of which we are citizens. We have a language, customs, rights, doctrines that we receive. As Thaddeus Kaczynski puts it, some of you know who he is, quote, "Authentic traditions, both natural and supernatural, embody and transmit the ultimate realities of man's existence, the transcendent origin, end, and meaning of things that cannot be grasped by the isolated individual and cannot be fully rationalized or defined. Ultimate reality must be experienced through and in its incarnation in tradition. It is in this sense that tradition is the eye that allows men to see the spiritual, eternal, and transcendent meanings hidden in the physical, temporal, and mundane facts of everyday existence." Unquote. Kaczynski's words are an apt description of what we mean by culture, that is, the shared ways in which a society or people is accustomed to expressing, celebrating, and perpetuating its vision of reality. A Catholic culture is the culture that a society inspired by the faith will produce and cherish. An environment that turns the mind of man to God gently and frequently, making a full use of the high beauties of fine art and the rugged genius of folk art, the impressive pageantry of ceremonial and the stabilizing force of rituals. Such a culture shapes the space and structures of the time in which we live, work, rest, play, fast, and feast. It points us to common goals and ultimate goals, to personal aims and collective aims. We can say without exaggeration that we owe a good part of our identity to a certain collective memory, the continually renewed remembrance of who and what we are, and all the cultural forms that embody this remembrance. This identity is not primarily conceptual or intellectual, but dwells in concrete, visible, audible, tangible expressions that serve as prompts for self-knowledge, incentives for competent action, and supports in turning to God or returning to Him if we have fallen away. So let me just give a concrete example. If you go to Europe, throughout cities in Europe, you see on almost every street corner, you see statues of Our Lady, or a statue of a saint. This is everywhere in the public architecture. That's an example of what a Catholic culture produces. Physical forms that embody the transcendent realities we believe. We're supposed to be surrounded by these things. They remind us of who we are, where we've come from, where we're going. Man is a rational, linguistic, artistic being. Each man is born into a family and a people, with a history of which he is a part and a native language. For these reasons, man is necessarily a cultural animal. To the extent that he is deprived of a rich cultural inheritance, or inherits it only piecemeal, he suffers dehumanization, a denaturing that leaves him feeling incomplete, fragmented, disoriented, unmoored. The inability to draw freely upon a heritage wider and deeper than oneself is a serious handicap, a wound, a form of poverty. In like manner, and for much the same reasons, man is a liturgical animal. The liturgy, after all, is the highest rational, linguistic, and artistic activity given to us in this life, and also the one most truly social or corporate. It is the activity par excellence of the church as the family and people of God. It is the most sublime expression of the interiority of man and of his sociability rooted in a common history. Since the liturgy is not something we make up as we go along, or shouldn't be, but something we are meant to receive as our most valuable possession, it follows that not to receive a rich inheritance of the sacred liturgy from our forefathers is contrary to both our social nature and our supernatural dignity. In my experience, however, modern Western people, especially those who live in big cities or who live semi-permanently in the subterranean habitat of the internet, are so cut off from traditional culture and the collective memory that they often look at you with a skeptical eye or a blank stare if you tell them that it is better to receive something handed down from tradition than to make it up yourself as you go along. It is by no means obvious anymore to moderns that it is essential, not accidental to human beings in general and to Christians in particular, to receive rather than to invent their identity, language, and culture. All we have to do is look at transgender and transhumanist ideologues to see that they think they invent their own identity. They don't receive it. Right? In a way, it's obvious that we inherit much of our identity. But it's also possible for us to try to break away from our inheritance and strike out on our own like the prodigal son, seeking to make our own way in the world, constructing a new culture or a new paradigm, as the progressives in the church like to say nowadays. I'll do it my way, crooned Frank Sinatra. And why not? Why is this wrong? Couldn't someone say in the church, as long as a pope or a bishop has the authority to create something new that seems more relatable or accessible or helpful to us, why shouldn't we go ahead and do it? After all, that's how it is with science and technology. We chuck out the inadequate to make way for the superior model. Why should we feel compelled in the area of liturgy or spirituality or fine art to take what was appropriate for people a long time ago and keep using it, conforming ourselves to it as to a Procrustean bed? That's the kind of objection somebody might raise. Maybe not exactly those words. So it seems to me that the central question about tradition is as follows. And I will use the letter X to stand for any traditional way of doing something. It could be ad orientem at Mass, it could be communion kneeling and on the tongue, it could be the use of Gregorian chant. I'm just going to use the letter X to represent all of that. Why should the fact that X was done for a long time be an argument that we should do it now? Let me arrange my response from the most superficial to the most essential. The first point that occurs to a traditionalist is something like this. If X was done for a long, long time, then it clearly worked. And it worked in a lot of very different circumstances. Precisely because X was done for so long, no alternative to X has been tested anywhere near so thoroughly. Of the options, X makes the most sense. That's a good argument. But the objector that we have in mind here thinks that modernity is so radically different from every previous set of circumstances that he doesn't think X has actually been tested over a wide enough variety of situations. Compared to modernity, he thinks all of antiquity and all the Middle Ages put together are just one giant situation called the Old World, or way back when. So he thinks like this. We have had two situations, modernity and everything before modernity. So the fact that X worked for one of the two situations is no argument that X is best for the other of the two situations. This mentality is perfectly conveyed in a memorandum from the Concilium in charge of the liturgical reform, dated September 9th, 1968. So, a little walk down memory lane here, 1968. The Concilium said, quote, "It is often impossible to preserve either orations that are found in the current Roman Missal or to borrow suitable orations being prayers here, from the treasury of ancient euchology. Indeed, prayer ought to express the mind of our current age, especially with regard to temporal necessities like the unity of Christians, peace in the world, and family. In addition, it seems to us that it is not always possible for the Church on every occasion to make use of ancient prayers, which do not correspond with the doctrinal progress visible in recent encyclicals, such as Pacem in Terris and Populorum Progressio, and in conciliar documents such as Gaudium et Spes." Unquote. There are many other such memoranda in the archives of the various groups of the Concilium and in the articles published by their members, but they all amount to the same claim. Modern man is so different from man of any other age that he might as well be a different species. The food of the past is not the food of the present or of the future. Concerning the text I just quoted, Matthew Hazel comments, quote, "Half a century on from the liturgical reform and the optimism of the conciliar age, it is difficult to believe that liturgists really considered modern man so unique that, for example, the prayers for peace contained in the older missals and sacramentaries were deemed entirely unsuitable for the modern age. Of course, advances in military technology mean that particular ethical considerations are more prominent in our day, such as whether the use of nuclear weapons in any way can ever be morally licit. However, if there is anything we should have learned in the last century, the 20th century, it is that modern man is fundamentally the same as man ever was, sinful, wretched, and in dire need of the salvific grace of God." Unquote. I would also like to point out that the view that these modern times are radically different from all previous times fails in its culpable ignorance of literature and of history. The fictional or semi-fictional figures of literature and the real persons of history amply show the sameness and continuity of human nature and its exigencies. Such figures as Achilles, Nestor, Paris, Helen, Aeneas, Dido, Anchises, Roland, Dante, Beatrice, Portia, Iago, Hamlet, King Lear, Don Juan, Quixote, Faust, the Bennett sisters, Tess, Micawber. I mean, you could go on with many, many famous literary figures and historical figures. Napoleon. All are human. All are subjects of the same virtues and vices. All are, in the contemporary expression, relatable to a greater or lesser extent. The permanent things Russell Kirk speaks of are permanent precisely because human nature and its necessary relationship to God do not change. Now, sometimes the difference between modernity and everything before modernity really is a reason to do something new. The objector has a point. But he has grossly overestimated the difference between modernity and pre-modernity when he concludes that this first argument is no argument at all. To say tradition has proved itself over time and has no serious competition really is an argument with some weight, even if it isn't decisive. So here's a second approach. Tradition helps us to know more than we would otherwise be able to know, and to develop our capacities to a much greater extent than if we were cut off from it. This can be seen most obviously in the case of traditions of fine art and craftsmanship. Any artist worth his salt knows that he has to master these traditions well before he can innovate well. He has to innovate within a tradition, or else his work will be hollow. Actually, more often than not, it just becomes a parody of the past. As Andre Gushorst Moore observes, quote, "The forms and conventions help us to see truly by bringing shape and form to the human imagination. Again, we come across something countercultural. Art in schools today will likely follow secular modernist conventions in which pupils are encouraged to be creative and express themselves, at which point they inevitably imagine modernist works reflecting the free-floating self. Convention cannot be easily escaped. He's saying, in other words, when you tell students in a modern art school to be themselves and be creative, they just produce all the same modernist claptrap. So they're just imitating a different convention. Man cannot create ex nihilo and can only imitate. And so the question appears of what to copy. In a Catholic and Benedictine context, one would hope for models from nature or from sacred art. The nearest human beings can come to the Creator and his genuine creativity. The Christian imagination will be fostered and educated by the best models if it is to become truly free and capable of being new. Unquote. The best philosophers, too, have discovered that one can philosophize well only within a tradition. Not as if philosophizing is the mindless repetition of what has been said before, but because it does include, essentially, being steeped in what was said before so that one can situate one's new insight within that larger context. It is not for nothing that Robert Maynard Hutchins and Mortimer Adler described their famous Great Books of the Western World series as the Great Conversation. For indeed, every thinker, poet, or intellectual of any kind in the West has entered into a living conversation that began long before him and will continue long after him. Even nihilists, deconstructionists, and absurdists depend on the tradition they critique or parody. And for those who attempt to ignore the tradition, their very lack of engagement with it cannot fail to be noticed, like the embarrassing silence of someone who has nothing to say when addressed with a question or a challenge. The only way to avoid entering the great human conversation is either to rise above it in mystical silence and union with the God who is beyond human words, or to sink beneath it into bestial grunting, shouting, and screaming. In the arts, this takes the form of cheap sensationalism or effete political gesturing. To be human is to be attuned to other men, to be a copier of great models, to be a partner in conversations that extend beyond our minds, conducted in languages that pre-exist us and shape our very thoughts. It should come as no surprise that something so integral to man's nature as divine worship will also be tradition-bound in this way. Patrick Owens explains this point well. Quote, "It is education that conserves and transmits the experience and wisdom of the previous generations so that such a cultural memory, identity, and common parlance can be forged and strengthened. Indeed, for most of human history, this enculturation has been a primary purpose of education. Language encapsulates the culture and the history of society. Those elements are passed to the successive generations through the language so that future generations may benefit from the sufferings and discoveries of their forebears and enjoy the comfort of participation in a transcendent community that reaches back through the ages. Rightly conceived, culture is the conscious ideal of human perfection and the habitual vision of greatness." I love that. Culture is the habitual vision of greatness. In the case of Catholic culture, this community originates with the apostles and our Lord himself. The language that provides the divine office with its poetic freedom and simultaneously constrains the prose to prescriptive ancient norms, he's talking about Latin, carries in its rich history an immense treasure of thought and feeling from both pre-Christian and apostolic times. For the better part of 2,000 years, it has provided the Church with a language of worship and intellectual clarity and a mark of Catholicity. Unquote. Those who are proposing X, who are saying we should keep X and value it, are in possession of the ball, or to use a different metaphor, they hold the high ground. The very fact that X has been done for a very long time, whether X is the study of Aristotelian logic and metaphysics, or training in calligraphy and draftsmanship, or the offering of Mass ad Orientem in Latin, shows that it is part of a common stock from which we draw when we try to express who and what we are as men or as Catholics. To say we are dependent on tradition in order to become ourselves is an argument. Again, not a demonstration, but an argument in favor of X. Does it follow from this that one can never do anything new in art, in philosophy, or in liturgy, or that one should never attempt it? No. And there has never been any age that did nothing new in these areas. Every age has brought in new works of art, new philosophy, new liturgical feasts, for example. But it does follow that whatever is new should relate itself to and make the best out of what is old. The innovator accomplishes the most when he shows how his new practice fits into the context of the whole tradition. But one can go deeper still, to a third approach. It is simply good for us to be in contact with the people who lived before us. I know a fellow who was living in the house his great-grandfather built. Whenever he mentions this to others, the reaction is spontaneous and always the same. How cool is that? Or some words to that effect. What's more, he practices the same profession as his father, who practices the same profession as his father, who practices the same profession as his father, all the way back to that great-grandfather who built the house. And people usually say, wow, that's wonderful. Is it necessary? No. But do we see it as a good? Yes, we do. I know another fellow who makes homemade pasta using the same recipe as his grandmother, who moved over to the United States from Italy. He does it because it's great to do it. The pasta tastes good, yes, but it is also simply good to cook with the same recipe as his grandmother. The reason this is so instinctive is that our social nature, the nature whereby it is good that we are not alone, but in a society, is inherently time-bound. Our instincts are telling us not that it is good to be only with our exact contemporaries, those who are exactly our own age, but rather that it is good for our lives to overlap with the elderly who went before us and the young who come after us, and to be ourselves young now and elderly later, in company with others. This same instinct tells us that it is good to have children, descendants, and that it is good to have ancestors. We cannot satisfy our social nature by living in contact only with those alive at this exact moment. And yet that is where we find ourselves in so much of modernity. Our lives resemble the lives of our forebears so little that when we think of it, we may feel lonely. Loneliness arises when one does not live with others. Spouses who cannot have children experience a grief that can be hard to understand until we grasp it as a kind of loneliness. But our languages don't have a word for the special kind of loneliness of living with no contact with present or future descendants. Similarly, people whose lives are simply cut off at every turn from the past, from their heritage, experience a kind of loneliness too. For lack of a word proper to it, this feeling is often called nostalgia. And that may be adequate if we mean nostalgia in its original sense as a cosmic homesickness. Modernity has a tendency to place us only or primarily with our peers and contemporaries. We see this in public education, where all the pupils in a class are the same age, or at the workplace, where there is usually not so much variety and where innovation is the buzzword. Or on TV and in the media, where a certain type of adult youthfulness is taken as not just the prime of man, but the only moment worthy of attention. Babies and the elderly are socially ignored or hidden away or seen as burdens rather than blessings, because they draw us into the past and into the future, out of the present in a sense. The loneliness of man as a social and cultural animal is overcome only by being in regular contact with our forefathers and with our posterity, in the many ways this can take place. The fact that we are cut off from the past in so many ways today makes it that much more important to make contact with the past in our religious practices. That's at least where it should continue, if nowhere else. Because Catholicism is and is meant to be experienced as a strong, visible community, Catholics live out man's social nature precisely as Catholics. Because of the communion of saints, the Catholic society is inherently trans-temporal. The saints of the past, living in the presence of God, are contemporaries of us who live in God's grace, but they remain precisely the personalities they were. They are not, so to speak, updated, as in the aggiornamento called for by John the 23rd at Vatican II. Just as the fellow who lives in his great-grandfather's house and the fellow who makes pasta with his grandmother's recipe love the house and the pasta, not only because it's good, but because it has a history, and the history belongs to all of the family as intangible spiritual property. So too, Catholics live in the house of faith and prayer that our ancestors built. And we prepare our supernatural recipes with the same ingredients and techniques they used. We want to pray in the same words the saints used when they prayed. We want to pray in the postures they prayed in. This is just something we intuitively know is good. It isn't something that needs an argument to prove it. The tremendous break between modernity and pre-modernity at nearly every point of life has led, I would say, to an astonishing loneliness in our times. But modernity cannot process the experience as loneliness. Modernity's hallmark is rational management from the third-person perspective, so-called scientific objectivity. And when you insist on this view from nowhere, you have no way of accounting for things that can only be seen from somewhere. So we deal with it through what I will call substitutes for tradition. We produce sentimental novels or movies or TV shows set in the past. We research our ancestors with powerful online tools and gain lots of head knowledge about our family trees and birth certificates. We might even collect old photographs. We have reference books about saints. In such ways, we try to compensate for the loss of actual connections with the past, such as a house to be lived in, a recipe to be cooked from, or most importantly, a liturgy and devotions to pray with. But head knowledge can never truly substitute for heart knowledge, any more than knowing about God can substitute for knowing God, being intimately united to him in love. At the start of the Bible, God says of Adam, "It is not good for man to be alone." When he creates Eve, he does not create merely a companion, for that might collapse into mutual solipsism or reciprocal egoism. He creates the origin of a family, a tribe, a village, a people, a nation, a church. It is not good for man to be alone, to be confined to himself, his own world, his own time period, his own generation, and its perspective. It's no better to be confined to a very particular time period of the past, such as the 1960s and 1970s. It is good for man to look out and look beyond, to look backwards and forwards, to look above him to eternity and around him to all generations past and future. In this way, he overcomes his original solitude and the curse of loneliness. The authentic Catholic attitude is one of humility, of piety for ancestors, of grateful receptivity to an inheritance. We trust that God has directed in broad lines the worship of the Church in every age, and that the resulting cumulative richness of tradition is good, desirable, beneficial, and worthy of attentive discipleship. We are in the position not of masters and owners, but of pupils and tenants. Tradition, especially what we call immemorial tradition, something so old that no one can point out where it began or remember who started it, reminds us of, and even makes present in a certain sense, the eternity and immutability of God. There's a reason Scripture talks about the everlasting hills. The hills have always been there and always will be, as a kind of permanent, even unchanging backdrop to the changeable round of daily human life. This is why a liturgical rite that looks and feels ancient does not have the effect of time travel to antiquity, but rather removes us from our confinement to the present and makes us breathe a different kind of air, an air that is more like a vintage wine, which is better for having been spared immediate consumption and allowed to rest and grow complex. It lifts us above the temporal, the ephemeral, the realm of the works of our hands that are perpetually being improved, reviewed, repaired, rejected, and replaced. Traditionalists, all other things being equal, find themselves less lonely and lost in modernity, more connected and more contented, because in fact they are experiencing the past as present, tradition as mine and also yours and everyone's, an inexhaustible transmitted content that carries us out of ourselves and out of the prison of the present, the modernism of the moment. We are, so to speak, living in our great-grandfather's house, which is also ours. We are eating our grandmother's food, which we know how to make. We are living in the rambling mansion and spacious fields God has provided for us, rather than an efficient and cramped apartment of our own making. The title of my talk uses the phrase, elevated by the past. Although each of us starts off in life as a blank slate, tabula rasa, we are born into a family, a culture, a heritage. The better this inheritance is assimilated by us, the higher is the basis, so to speak, from which we engage reality. The low road, rocky, rough, muddy, difficult, circuitous, is the road of the man with little access or attachment to tradition. The feral child of the woods, so to speak. And therefore only his own mental equipment and perhaps a few pieces of equipment borrowed haphazardly from others. The high road, dry, smooth, and more direct, is the road made by the wisdom of tradition. Now I want to talk for a little while about conservatism and what's the difference between conservatism and traditionalism. The distinction between the conservative and traditional movements within the church is that, for the former, tradition is purely conventional, worth hanging on to whenever possible, to be sure, but not intrinsically worthwhile and constitutive of human rationality and society. Conservatism is what's left over when one has lost the battle for one's culture. One holds on with a death grip to favored externals, to sentimental moments, because the force of life has vanished. That is why Catholic conservatism is often content to retain outward signs of tradition, for example, incense, Gregorian chant, without fully embracing their inward reality. The traditionalist movement sees things quite differently. What matters most is the integrity of the Mass, that this liturgy be in vital continuity with the past in every step of its growth. The smells and bells enhance the experience and are, of course, part of the tradition. They are certainly fitting for the occasion, but they cannot substitute for the lack of traditional content in text, music, and rubrics. To understand better what is wrong with conservatism, we need to be aware of the extent to which it already buys into modernity's basic presuppositions. To the extent that the term modernity refers not merely to a chronological period, but to a worldview or set of beliefs or range of commitments at their extreme form ideologies, we must say, without mincing words, that modernity is predicated on the rejection of tradition. Modernity is predicated on the rejection of tradition. Not just various traditions, but tradition as such. That is, the humble and grateful reliance on the cultural patrimony received from our forefathers. Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, famously makes the repudiation of tradition and the trust in his own reason alone the basis of his entire philosophy. And every modern thinker after him has done the same to one degree or another, even though they are all trapped in an inescapable contradiction because they can think and speak only in a language they have inherited from a cultural context. The only exceptions in the world of thought are those who, like the Thomists, the followers of St. Thomas Aquinas, who expressly ally themselves with a pre-modern tradition and who thereby gain the reputation of being, to one degree or another, anti-modern. The 19th century socialist reformer Alexander Herzen distinguishes between two types of reformers: those who stand in judgment over the past, but have weak knees and end up sentimentally rescuing or tolerating some of it, and those who, with a Nietzschean will to power, find satisfaction in thoroughly smashing up the past and cleansing the present of it, to the extent they can. His description of the former type may remind us of such figures as John Paul II and Benedict XVI, while his description of the latter type will remind us eerily of the mentality and actions of Pope Francis. So listen to this, quote, "People are afraid of their modern logic, and having rashly summoned to court the church, the state, the family, and morality, good and evil, they endeavor to save some scraps, fragments of the old. But there are those who, more in keeping with that logic, discard the last ballast of the past and march boldly forward. In passing from the old world to the new, one can take nothing along. We are to be the executioners of the past. To us is left the task of persecuting and identifying the past, no matter what disguise it assumes, and of executing it and laying it upon the altar of the future." Unquote. Conservatism, then, is nothing other than a slow-motion version of the same liberalism that rejects tradition, for conservatives wish to keep this or that particular tradition while generally accepting the modern stance against the great tradition in its totality. Put differently, a conservative is one who wants to keep pretty pieces of the whole, but not the whole itself, and who puts the pieces ahead of the whole. For example, a conservative Catholic will say he loves ad orientem and incense and chant at Mass, but he does not want the liturgy that gave rise to and perfectly suits that orientation and that chant. He may not care what the priest is saying when he is facing ad orientem, whether it's the Roman canon or the pseudo-Roman, pseudo-Eucharistic prayer of pseudo-Hippolytus. As far as he's concerned, the sweet smell of incense is more important than a lex orandi that reaches us unbroken from the earliest centuries of the Church. In this way, the conservative is also entirely modern in his picking and choosing, as from a superior platform, what elements of tradition are to be retained and which ones jettisoned. The results are usually arbitrary and incoherent to those who are familiar with the tradition in its fullness. We must recognize that we who appreciate, who love tradition, and here we are talking not only about the Church's liturgical tradition, but about everything she has received from the hand of divine providence, and indeed the sum total of all cultural goods that precede the present moment. We are fighting a battle of unprecedented and even unimaginable proportions. Everyone is against us. The modern secularist governments that try to erase their own history, recall the Constitution debacle a few years back in the European Union when they created a constitution for themselves without even mentioning Christianity, as if you could define Europe without Christianity. Modern industries that rely on people being mindless consumers with no moral bearings. Modern media that drown their addicts in a continual flux of largely useless and heavily manipulated information. And shockingly, a large part of the hierarchy of the Church, which, like Pope Francis, explicitly repudiates tradition, seeing every earlier phase of Catholicism as a mere stepping stone or prelude to the latest and greatest development. Basically, everyone in the modern world has become habituated to think of change and progress as the only goods, and to think of tradition as superseded, either practically irrelevant or actually repressive and dangerous. Because this entire view is so deeply false and harmful to the Catholic faith and to human life itself, our life as social and cultural animals, we must be serious about rejecting it and living as best we can according to the truth of our nature. If that means living temporarily at odds with or in opposition to the Church's hierarchy or to some political authorities, so be it. No one ever promised that the hierarchy would be totally immune to cultural contamination or ideological infiltration. And when we see that such has occurred, we must keep a respectful distance. Obedience to the truth is also and always obedience to received and approved tradition. Only in and by modernity have these fraternal twins, truth and tradition, ever been separated and opposed to each other. Coming now to a conclusion. The spiritual and cultural inheritance of Catholicism is not just window dressing or the icing on the cake. It is the primary carrier or vehicle of a social religion. The Catholic Church is a perfect society, societas perfecta, that lives, moves, and has its being from apostolic tradition and the multitude of ecclesiastical traditions that sprang forth from it in the way artistic accomplishments rise from generations of trained artisans. Adhering to this patrimony is not easy in a revolutionary age, but the alternative is absorption into the world, cultural apostasy, spiritual amnesia, a frightening loss of identity, of meaning, of values, and of direction. We are living in a strange in-between time, a time of rebuilding and restoring what was foolishly squandered in the past 60 years or so. In spite of the fact that Catholicism in its fullness overcomes our existential isolation, men and women seeking to be traditional Catholics today may find themselves suffering an accidental loneliness. Individuals in this or that place may have a hard time meeting other like-minded co-religionists, or finding a spouse who shares their ideas and their devotions, or finding a tradition-loving monastery or convent to enter. These are real problems that cause real suffering, yet in their nature, they are temporary. The rebuilding of the bridge between past, present, and future is already happening all over the world. It will take a few generations to make the bridge strong again. Meanwhile, the modernist or progressivist form of Catholicism is greedily consuming itself. It does not have the wherewithal to endure. If what I have argued is true, it is self-contradictory, like a battery running down with no possibility of recharging. That's how I would describe progressivism. It's just fueled by the fumes of Western civilization. And when the fumes run out, progressivism dies. It kills itself. It may seem that everyone is against us, but truth is on our side. Tradition, the democracy of the dead, as Chesterton called it, is on our side. And that means ultimately God is on our side. There is no reason for despair. There is reason for courage and clear commitment. Why do intelligent Catholics wring their hands at supposedly insoluble problems, feel tempted to rush along with fads and fashions, and resist the still small voice that calls them back to the potent treasury of the ages? Surely, much of it is due to ignorance of traditional solutions, to systematic brainwashing, and to the sleepless efforts of demons, who know that the worst thing that can happen to a modern person from their point of view is to be lifted up out of his modern prison into the breadth and depth of Catholicism. It is understandable that the devil would do all he can to thwart this conversion of mind and heart, for in each and every soul that undergoes it, tradition lives again in our midst and brings new life to a world out of date. Thank you for your kind attention. So we have some time now for questions, if there are any. Yes.
So, do you think that American conservative Catholicism is going to help or be a hindrance to this movement?
So I should just clarify one thing, which is that terminology is always tricky. People use different terms in different ways. So liberal, conservative, progressive, traditional, or traditionalist are, I think people have a general idea what those terms mean, but they're sufficiently fuzzy that they can mean different things to different people. So what I describe as a traditional or even traditionalist mentality is something that some conservatives might very well share, and they might just call it conservatism, or they might call it paleo-conservatism or something like that. So I don't want to get too hung up on the words. The difficulty that I was pointing to is that, to put it as simply as possible, conservatism, especially American political conservatism, is liberalism in slow motion. That's how I put it. So if you just look at the history of our country, the positions that liberals have taken rapidly, conservatives often take slowly over time. And that's because the liberals are more aggressive and they push more and they push the threshold and the envelope. And the conservatives initially resist, but eventually they kind of either they tolerate it or they say, well, we have to accept that evil, we have to tolerate that evil so we can fight the next battle. They keep losing. It's kind of a losing battle. Conservatism is liberalism in slow motion. And traditionalism is, I mean, granted, it's a David and Goliath situation because there aren't very many of us who hold this view. But the traditionalists would say, no, we're not going to compromise on any of these things. We have to remain true to our entire heritage and our entire vision, even if that means, that we're going to be ostracized and mocked and, and whatever the case might be. But this is what Ratzinger called a creative minority. He says that in the history of the church, the great reform movements begin with creative minorities, right? And that's something I really like to emphasize to people. Sometimes people get too caught up with the idea of numbers, and they ask, well, how can such a small group of Catholics as those who, let's say, self-describe as traditional, how can they really make a difference? They're so outnumbered, right? Well, first of all, Scripture is full of cases where God wins victories through massively outnumbered forces, and he actually likes to do that. He prefers to. He sent away Gideon's soldiers so he could defeat the enemies with fewer people to show who is the one really in charge. But also, and more basically, throughout history, all important movements, both good and bad, have started with one or a few people. Just think about every great religious order. Dominicans, Franciscans, Benedictines, Jesuits, they all started with one man, right? And think about the massive impact those have had on Western history. So we just have to strive to be saints, and to strive to be as good as we can be as Catholics, and as traditional as we can be, and let the Lord do the rest.
Just last week I was in Mexico and I was getting jealous how Mexico looked more Catholic than our supposedly Catholic Acadiana. And I was thinking, right here, one of the big cultural differences is that most people in Mexico you think are more extroverted and more people in America are more introverted. Do you think that the suppression of tradition in the United States might have to do with the fact that we're more introverted people than extroverted?
Well, no, I don't know. That's maybe too psychological and too broad a brush to paint with. I do think that there is a point to saying that the United States has a heavy Protestant influence from the very beginning that affects everybody, even Catholics in this country who have their own Catholic culture. They've been forced to live within a country that was largely designed and governed by Protestants and by Protestant assumptions about economics and politics and religion. And so, for example, Americans tend to be, we've kind of assumed that religion belongs to the private sphere. This is part of I would call it a lie, because I think it is a lie. It's part of the lie of saying we can have religious peace with all these different denominations as long as nobody talks about their faith, nobody makes it external, and that's completely against the Catholic idea of, we go out into the street with our Lord on Corpus Christi in a procession, right? And we show what we believe. And in general, we should show what we believe, not obnoxiously, not violently, but in a way that isn't just privatizing it. Whereas in a country like Mexico, of course, Mexico is suffering a lot from modernization as well, and has been for a while. And of course, we have the Cristeros, we have the Freemasonic persecution of Catholics there. But in general, their culture, because it is more Catholic, more of a Catholic culture, they're much more willing and they enjoy sharing their faith, and it's something that spills out of the church into the public square. And that's, so yeah, I do think these kinds of differences are relevant to understanding our histories. But in Europe, most countries in Europe were Catholic cultures as well, and they've been completely swept over by modernism and liberalism and secularism. And I think in that case, it had a lot to do with World War I and World War II and the devastating, spiritual impact that those had on people. Yes.
So we are from Texas, and our DLM in Austin has, over the time, evolved into a robust dialogue mass. Mm-hmm. And so this practice of a dialogue mass, is that something that we should resist, or is it something that we could embrace as a good and organic development?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she's asking about the dialogue mass. I have experienced the dialogue mass successfully done, by which I mean a community of people who were capable of making the responses coherently and roughly the same time, so it didn't become this kind of chaotic, free-for-all. So I mean, that's definitely possible, and I've experienced it, and I don't have a problem with it myself. I wouldn't want to suggest that should be adopted by everybody, or certainly, and much less imposed on everybody, which was what the liturgical movement was kind of, the liturgical movement was heading in the direction before the Second Vatican Council of wanting to, well, basically, viewing active participation as always saying or doing something. So if you're not saying something, you're not doing something, then you're not participating in Mass. And that's completely false. And anybody who has experience worshiping in the traditional Latin Mass knows how rich and deep a participation can take place, even if you were saying nothing, and even if all you're doing is kneeling the whole time, right? I mean, I like to say to people, I didn't even know what participation meant until I started going to the Latin Mass, and then I really found out what it meant. Because up until then, I had been too busy with superficial and external activity. So that being said, I just wouldn't impose it on people, but if there's a particular community that's used to doing it, I don't think it should be stopped,
It seems like one of the things that keeps us moderns from really living out the traditions that our ancestors did is a kind of bad self-awareness. So the example I was thinking of actually isn't liturgical, but like if a young child from here wanted to go learn, the traditional music, he would say, oh, I play or I sing Cajun music. But even in labeling it that, he's already kind of admitted a little bit of a rupture there, because you have the self-awareness to differentiate what you're doing from simply what is done. And so I was wondering, number one, should this kind of self-awareness be overcome? And if so, how?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the things you're pointing to is that it's actually, I wouldn't argue that it's necessary to culture that it be done unself-consciously with no awareness of alternative ways of doing it, because even in the Middle Ages, there was awareness on the part of some people that things were done differently elsewhere. So it's not like this is a purely modern phenomenon to have the awareness that what we do, the way we dress, the way we eat is our local custom and other people do it a different way. That's not a problem to be aware of that. What I think is a problem is that modern Western people are so inundated constantly with a kind of superficial, international, globalist, non-culture, produced. I mean, if you think about pop music, it's created essentially in laboratories by capitalist corporations and then just spread throughout the world like a virus or like a poison gas, and then it just contaminates everybody. And suddenly everybody in the whole world, from Tokyo to New York to Bangladesh, whatever, they're all listening to the same pop songs. That's a very weird thing that we have going on right now, and it's because of the internet primarily, I would say. But it was already happening before the internet. But the internet made it possible to do it on a global scale. And so I think that now it requires a more energetic effort to want to preserve culture. And if you, for instance, if you just want to preserve something like classical music, right, then it needs to be taught, and somebody falls in love with it, and because they fall in love with it, then they want to keep doing it, and it's something that's coming from within. It's an internal motivation. And at that point, being aware that other people are listening to other things isn't going to matter so much, because you love what you're doing. You've been given something beautiful from your cultural inheritance that you can carry on. But I think actually the easiest, I said this point in my talk, that the easiest place in which to preserve culture, paradoxically, is the Catholic Church. Now I say paradoxically because it seems like tradition is under attack and culture is under attack in the church, and it certainly is, even from the top level. But we have very definite cultural practices like Gregorian chant that are not obscure. They don't require you to be a paleographer and an expert in 15 languages. Almost anybody, like a 6-year-old, can learn to sing the Salve Regina. So we have this wonderful cultural inheritance that's very accessible to us. And even in places where, let's say, chant hasn't been sung for decades, all it takes is a few people with love of that music and a little bit of know-how, and they can bring it back again. And within a year, it can be flourishing, right? So I almost consider it miraculous, but I think our Catholic culture has this wonderful power of regeneration. And it's easier to do that than say, to recreate a certain form of like Appalachian bluegrass music or something. Maybe that's maybe harder to do, but the Catholic Church has this wonderful heritage, and it's been active even recently, even within the memory of some people who are still alive, that tradition. And it never stopped either. That's the other thing I would point out. Nothing that like Ad Orientem, Latin, chant, all those things never really stopped. They mostly stopped in most places, but they were always going on somewhere. So we have a living connection with all of our forefathers in their faith. The traditional Latin Mass was never stopped being celebrated at some place in the world, right? So it's not like a situation where, I'll give you a counterexample. There are people today who want to revive the Sarum rite. Now, I think that's a grand idea. And there are some examples even in Scripture where like the Israelites stopped worshiping for decades, and then they started worshiping again. So you could have a gap, a real gap, and then you could start up the temple sacrifices as they did. In our case, the Sarum rite hasn't been celebrated since Reformation times because King Henry VIII, not King Henry, well, because it was after Henry VIII, but the English Book of Common Prayer replaced the Sarum rite and all the other local rites in England. And then when the Jesuits came back, all the famous Jesuits like Edmund Campion and so on, by that time they were celebrating the Trinity Mass, not the Sarum rite. So the Sarum rite, which was the rite proper to a certain part of England and to the court of the king, which is this magnificent medieval rite, somewhat quite different from the Tridentine rite. It just stopped, it perished, because of that violent action. But we have all the liturgical books to the Sarum rite. And there was just recently published a book of rubrics about how to celebrate everything, Vespers, Mass, baptism, whatever you want to do in the Sarum rite you could do, just as it was done in the lifetime of Thomas Tallis, the composer, right? And if the former Anglicans, who are now Catholics especially, if they want to celebrate the Sarum rite, which is really the rite that's proper to their English tradition, their English medieval tradition, they should do it. Why not? So I think even in a case of a long interruption, it would be possible to revive something like that. And then I should just add this, that if you did revive it, probably the first people who pioneered that would feel very self-conscious about it. It would be like, they might even feel a little bit like they were actors, like we're doing something that was, the last time this was done was the 16th century. Actually, there have been some particular Vespers and Masses in the Sarum rite, but I mean not in a very public way. But I think as time went on and people became accustomed to it again, it would become natural. It would become connatural, and you could do it unself-consciously, right?
Dr. Kwasdewski, is there any particular point in time or history in your studies that you've come across where Catholics were having to rediscover their culture in Mass that's similar to our times? Or do you see this as more of an outlier? And secondly, if you could also maybe talk about religious communities, how important is it for us to be able to reestablish religious communities and to be able to have an anchor to our faith and to the past?
Okay, so the second question was about religious communities, you mean like monks, nuns? Yeah, well, I mean, I have to start with that. I think that you can demonstrate from the Catholic tradition that the contemplative religious life was always seen as the burning heart of the church. That's kind of the engine of grace that all of us depend on. We depend on the Carmelite nuns that we may never know in this life. We hope to meet them in the next life and find out how much we rely on their prayers. But that's always been the case. The monks, the nuns, the hermits they've been like the Marines of the church, they're like the special forces, right? That's the way they go. So the renewal of the church is directly connected with the health of religious life. I would say even more than the health of the clergy, the diocesan clergy, the religious life is the barometer of the spiritual health of the church in general. And I think that's part of the reason why we're hurting so much right now, because we certainly do have very faithful and committed religious, but not very many of them compared to what used to be the case. So I think that renewal is clearly going to be connected with that. And that's why, by the way, I don't think it's surprising that the people who are against the traditional Latin liturgy are also against the contemplative religious life. It's these two things go hand in hand, right? Also because the traditional liturgy is very contemplative in nature, so it's especially well suited to contemplative religious, right? If you think of Carthusians, you think of men who are chanting psalms and living in, and with long periods of silence, right? give something kind of like the experience of Latin Mass. But your earlier question is a very interesting one. I would say, speaking of the church as a whole, there has never been a time when a traditional liturgical rite has not been handed down and continued somewhere in the church, even if in another place it was destroyed by a Muslim invasion or by the Anglicans under Henry VIII or Elizabeth or something like that. So in particular places, the local churches can be extinguished and even their rites can perish. But overall, there's always been the tradition being handed on. And that's why I think that what happened in the 20th century was quite extraordinary. Although even there, even when Paul VI imposed a new liturgy, that didn't instantly overnight mean that everybody started using that. There were always a small number of priests and religious who continued to use the traditional rites. And of course, there were always Eastern Catholics who continued to use their traditional rites, and they're also part of the Church of Christ, so we shouldn't forget about that too. The only example that might be relevant is the Arian crisis in the 4th century. There were places in the 4th century where it became very difficult for Catholics to go to Mass because the Arians basically took over in different spots. And there were some dioceses where when the Catholic bishop died, an Arian bishop was put in his place, or even a bishop, outed himself as an Arian, if you will. And in those cases, the faithful often wouldn't go to the liturgy that the bishop was celebrating because they didn't want to have anything to do with it. St. Basil famously talks about Catholics who are out in the wilderness beseeching God because they can't go to a church anymore. That's not exactly the same kind of situation, but at least it's a situation where Catholics found themselves in really sore straits, really dire straits because of episcopal malfeasance.
Is there a possibility in your view that, because modernism is kind of moving so quickly at this point, that it is causing the divide between the tradition and the modernistic view to be so separate that the truth is becoming more evident because of that?
Yes.
And if so, is it almost like going to help increase the awareness of the people that are kind of been on the fence or not aware at all?
Yes. Yeah, so I mean, a simple way to answer your question would be to say that when Pope Francis released Traditionis Custodes, it was the single greatest advertisement for the traditional Mass that ever happened in 50 years. Right? I mean, suddenly millions of people were wondering, what is he talking about? Why is he so upset about this? Maybe we should go and check it out. There's a very funny meme that shows an usher holding a bunch of extra chairs, and it says, the Sunday after Traditionis Custodes, usher be like, and you get all these extra chairs. And it's true. I mean, I think many of us who go have seen this dramatic. Well, really, it was a twofold process. First, COVID hit, and during the COVID period, a lot of Catholics realized the only place I can go, either to go to Mass, maybe I have to sneak in the door to a private Mass, but the only place I can get to Mass, the only place I can receive on the tongue kneeling is at this traditional parish or chapel. And so they weren't really even looking for tradition, they were just looking for the kind of, the reverent way of receiving communion that they had become accustomed to in the Novus Ordo in some places. And so God was showing them something more than what they were looking for, more than what they expected. COVID was the first, and then Traditionis Custodes was the second. So one principle that should be very dear to us as Catholics, and it should keep us from ever being too depressed about anything, is the Felix Culpa principle, right? Which is, that's in the Exultet at Easter, the deacon sings, O Felix Culpa, O happy fault of Adam that gained for us so great a Redeemer. And God brings good out of evil. He always finds a way to bring good out of evil. We may not see it immediately, we may never see it in a certain case in this life, but we can sometimes see it quite dramatically. We can certainly see it in the case of Adam's fall, because his fall, in a sense you can say his fall brought to us Christ our Redeemer. I mean, there's a debate about that among theologians. Like, if Adam had never fallen, would Christ have anyway, but we don't have to get into that tonight. And so similarly here, I think that just speaking for myself, I never reflected on tradition until I started to notice how much modernity hates tradition. And then I thought, what's going on here? Like, what is it about modernity that makes it generally anti-traditional, and what is it about tradition that people used to love? Why was it kind of the way people lived for so many millennia, that you did things the way you did because it was the way your father and his father did it, and you pray this way because it's the way that people prayed before. And so really it was the drama of our current situation that prompted me to start reflecting on these things. And I think that's true in one way or another for all of us. Right?
Do you have like a framework of when it's okay to be like disobedient?
It so happens.
It's a great book in the back.
It so happens. I should tell you, I had in grad school at Catholic University of America, I had this wonderful Dominican priest, an elderly Dominican priest, actually from Arnaudville, he would come down to DC to teach. And he had these big Coke bottle glasses, and he was bald, so he kind of looked like a frog, which is, I guess, appropriate for this part of Louisiana. Anyway, he's now deceased, and he rest in peace. He was a very holy man, but a funny man too. Whenever students would ask him a question, he would say, I have a book. I have an article. Because that's always how he would begin his answer. Because he had written about everything intimistic methods. So I haven't written about everything in regard to this question, but I do have a little book called True Obedience. And it's not a long booklet either. And I go fully into what is the virtue of obedience, what's the nature of it, what are the limits of it, what's the hierarchy of authorities, such that the lower authority has to be in harmony with the higher authority, and if the lower authority isn't, then he loses his right to be obeyed and things of that sort. So I go into all of that. It is, I would say, in a way, the question of our times, or at least one of the big questions of our time.
I'm still fairly new to this internet, but I started a little family sort of mess, but now I'm really grew up in it, so I reject it. So, you're saying they reject the simplicity aspect of it. It's true that there's something when I go to event mass, but there's I think a woundedness in the church. It's so deeply hurt, and things gone so extremely opposite that God is like calling for us to return to restore my church, because I've known forever. I mean, I've had a couple of thank you for being there. And God provides some grace and courage to do it, like media, it's like here. And but there's something that just they never, I don't know how they'll ever meet, but it's almost like they need to just be there, the presence to restore.
Yes, so if I understand what you're saying, it sounds to me like what Benedict XVI was hoping would happen, which is that by a renewed presence of the Roman Rite in its traditional form, in its long transmitted form, by the presence of it, it would have a kind of gravitational pull and start to bring other aspects of the church back to tradition. That's what I think he hoped for. That was happening all over the place. And I mean, not to get too much into, my talk last night was all about Pope Francis, all about popes, and we did talk about a lot about Pope Francis, but what I call the aging Vatican II hippies are not happy. We're not happy with the Pope Benedict's project. The progressives and the liberals and the modernists in the church, those are not quite synonymous phrases, but all of them are very much of the opinion that the past is, I like to use this metaphor sometimes for progressivism, that they view the past as like the booster rocket that gets the spaceship to a certain point and then it falls away so that the rest of the spaceship can keep going, right? It's something that has to fall away and fall into the ocean, and sink. And that's not how Catholics think about it at all. Right? We have, our concept of tradition is more of an organic concept. We think about tradition, I would say, as a tree, like a great big oak tree. And the great big oak tree, it keeps growing and growing, but it remains what it is. It's always an oak tree. It doesn't become, a maple tree. And as it gets bigger, the roots go down further. And so the strength of that tree and the vitality of that tree depend upon the depth of its roots. And it's fixed in place. It doesn't wander around. It just grows in one place and gets to be more and more what it is while remaining the same, right? And I think that's a good image for tradition and for liturgical tradition as well. It does develop over time, but it develops by becoming more fully what it is, not by becoming something completely different.
So why does it feel like we're two religions and one faith? I often get that, in one church.
Well, I think, so he asked, why does it sometimes feel like we are two religions in one church? So I think part of the reason for that is that the word religion itself, most people use the word religion to mean a body of doctrines, but originally the word religion has more to do with the symbols and actions by which we pay homage to God. That's what the word religion means for St. Thomas Aquinas, for example. And so if you were to say to Thomas, what is religion? He would say, it is all of those actions by which we pay homage to God in justice, because we owe it to him. And that's a debt of our created nature. And so a religion is really more characterized initially by its whole system of rites and symbols than by anything else. Now, contained in the rites and symbols implicitly, and sometimes explicitly, is a whole set of doctrines. And then you get the modern sense of the word religion, which is all the doctrines that we hold and the morals that we follow. But what I'm trying to say is that a modern form of worship and a traditional form of worship externally look radically different from each other. And in a Thomistic sense, you could say they're two religions, right? I realize most people don't speak that way, but I'm just pointing out that the diversity is such that it could seem like two different systems of honoring God, a way to approach God. And I do think that when you push further, you do start to find doctrinal differences as well. I'm not arguing here that there really are two distinct religions, but only that it's not surprising that they appear to be distinct. And in fact, there are really distinctions. And that's the drama of our time, is that there's a real clash happening. We can see this with the Synod on Synodality. We can see it with the bishops that Pope Francis picks for various offices. In other words, what we see is a group that really thinks quite differently about what the Catholic faith is than not only traditionalists, but even than Benedict XVI and John Paul II, right? So I think that it's a very dramatic moment right now. And I mean, I actually remain hopeful for the future because of what I said in my talk, namely that liberalism or progressivism has a way of self-destructing. I think there's a hubris or an arrogance in it that goes so far that it goes too far and then subverts itself. And that's part of what somebody was talking about here. Oh, you were talking about this again. That because certain people are so flagrant now about rejecting some of the teachings, even of popes just within living memory, it wakes the rest of us up to say, okay, well then something's wrong here. What is wrong? What happened? Whereas if the liberals were more clever and more patient, maybe they could accomplish more, but it would take them longer, and they're impatient, right? We're all impatient in different ways, but I think that they're especially impatient partly because they sense that this is the time. They have to act right now, because pretty soon the only priests that are going to be left, and therefore the only bishops that are going to be left, are ones that don't have any memory of Vatican II, and for whom Vatican II is about as relevant as the Second Council of Constantinople. And when that happens, the whole progressivist movement is over. So they have to act quickly right now, and that's why they're really showing their hand, right?
So over the last 5 years, the traditional movement has kind of exploded from the new scandals in the U.S. and the COVID converts. A lot of people in the last 5 years have had like a crash course over the last 50 years. And because of that, sometimes a lot of Christian communities, they kind of fall into the same postmodern tendency of just picking and choosing a lot of different things, traditional, not Catholic
Because it's kind of what I was saying in the talk is that when you're living in a situation where tradition has become disputed territory, then suddenly you can have as many versions of tradition as there are people who are thinking about it and who think they know what it is, but they haven't really studied and experienced enough to know what it is. And we all know that there are people like this in every community. They think they know more than they do, and then they start arguing with people about it and how things should be. But I mean, I think if you're talking about within the context of a community that is centered on the traditional Latin Mass and the other traditional sacramental rites, the most important thing to do is to be very consistent with following the rubrics, whether you're following the 62 rubrics or the pre-55 rubrics, and then people just simply need to respect, this is the way things are done here. And I mean, of course, there are times when there's a lot to know. Tradition is a very rich body of practices, and therefore anybody can be mistaken, and even a priest can be mistaken. We know that sometimes all the time with completely good faith, they sing something the wrong way, or they say something at the wrong time, or they turn around at the wrong time, whatever. And so then lay people have to be very gentle and find a very courteous way to say something about that. Or perhaps better yet, tell the MC and have the MC say something, or something like that, right? So I think, I mean, correction can go in all different directions, but often what you're talking about is more from, I think, the priest to the people, because in every community there's somebody who's watched, 58 Taylor Marshall videos or something, and then suddenly they think like they're the great expert on Catholic tradition. No, that's just not the case, right? Sorry, and I'm not attacking Taylor Marshall, I'm just saying that there's a kind of phenomenon where the internet is so full of information, and there's no, and I mean, maybe this is just as well for now, because I don't really want to have either the government or the church hierarchy trying to rate and evaluate content, media content. That's not a good idea at this moment. But in fact, it's just a big free-for-all, a big free market. And anybody who has a video camera and a microphone can set up shop and start podcasting and talking about whatever he wants. And so, anyway, so this is the strange world we're living in, right? Okay, maybe I'll stop there, but I'll go back to the table if you want to come back to the table there and say hello. Check out some of the books, perhaps. All right, thank you so much for coming.